Welcome to Monk's Temple. I'd like you to try something with me right now. Just for a moment. Close your eyes if you're in a space where you can, or simply soften your gaze if you're not. And I want you to notice something you've probably never noticed before. Notice that you are breathing. Feel the air entering your body. Feel it leaving. That's it. Just that. Now, while you're noticing the breath, also notice something else. Notice that there's a part of you that's observing the breath. There's the breath, and then there's the awareness of the breath. They're not the same thing. The breath comes and goes. The awareness, that's something else entirely. This simple experiment reveals something profound about the nature of your mind. There's the content of your experience, the thoughts, the sensations, the emotions, the breath itself. And then there's the context, the awareness that holds all of it. For most of our lives, we're so completely absorbed in the content that we forget the context entirely. We're like someone watching a movie so intensely that they forget they're sitting in a theater. They forget they're the one watching. The Buddha built an entire psychology around this distinction. He saw that human suffering isn't caused by the content of our experience. It's caused by our relationship to that content. It's caused by what we do with the raw materials that life presents to us. And what we do, according to the Buddha, is we fabricate. Now, the word fabrication might sound strange in this context. We usually think of fabrication as lying, or maybe as manufacturing something in a factory. But the Buddha used it in a very specific way. He pointed to 3 activities that the mind is engaged in, constantly, every moment you're awake. He called them the 3 sankharas, the 3 fabrications. And understanding these 3 activities is the key to understanding why you can't stop thinking, why you get caught in emotional storms, and most importantly, how to find genuine peace. Let me give you a modern psychological framework for this. Imagine your mind as a film projector. Behind you, there's a bright light, that's your basic awareness. In front of the light, there's a reel of film spinning, that's your memories, your conditioning, your habits, the raw material from your past. And then there's the lens that focuses the light through the film and projects an image onto the screen. That lens, that focusing mechanism, that's fabrication. The Buddha identified 3 distinct lenses. 3 ways the mind shapes raw potential into actual experience. The first lens is bodily fabrication. In the Buddha's own words, this is the breath. But it's not just the breath as we normally think of it. It's the entire felt sense of the body responding to the mind's intentions. Before you consciously know you're feeling anxious, your breathing has already changed. It's become shallow, rapid, high in the chest. Before you consciously register anger, your jaw has already begun to clench, your shoulders have started to rise. The body is always listening to the mind, and it responds instantly. This bodily response then feeds back into the mind, creating a loop. The anxious breath makes the mind more anxious. The clenched jaw intensifies the anger. This is the first assembly line of the mind's factory. The second lens is verbal fabrication. This is your inner voice. The constant narrator. The voice that comments on everything. This is good. This is bad. I like this person. I don't like that person. Why did she say that? What if he thinks I'm stupid? I should have said something different. I hope tomorrow goes well. Studies in neuroscience suggest that this inner voice is active nearly every waking moment. It's the storyteller. And the stories it tells determine the emotional quality of your entire life. If it tells stories of scarcity and threat, you live in anxiety. If it tells stories of resentment and blame, you live in anger. If it tells stories of inadequacy, you live in shame. The third lens is mental fabrication. This one has two parts. The first part is perception, the labels you put on everything. You see a shape, and your mind labels it tree. You feel a sensation in your stomach, and your mind labels it hunger. You hear a sound, and your mind labels it criticism or praise. These labels aren't neutral. They come loaded with associations, with history, with emotional charge. The second part is feeling, not emotion, but the basic affective tone of every experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Every single moment carries one of these three tones. And the mind has a deep, instinctive drive to move toward the pleasant, push away the unpleasant, and ignore the neutral. This drive is the engine of suffering. Now, here's what makes this teaching so radical and so immediately useful. These three lenses aren't just running automatically, beyond your control. They are activities. They are things you do. You are breathing in a particular way right now. You are talking to yourself in a particular way right now. You are perceiving and feeling in a particular way right now. And because these are activities, because they are things you do, you can learn to do them differently. This is where meditation stops being some exotic, mystical practice and becomes the most practical skill you could ever develop. In meditation, you're not trying to escape from life. You're not trying to achieve some special altered state. You're simply learning to observe these three fabrications in action. You're learning to see how you breathe when you're calm versus when you're agitated. You're learning to hear the stories your inner voice tells. You're learning to notice the labels you slap onto experience and the feeling tones that drive your reactions. And in learning to see them, you gain something precious: choice. You begin to see that you don't have to breathe the way you've always breathed. You don't have to tell yourself the same stories you've always told. You don't have to perceive the world through the same old filters. You become, for the first time, the architect of your own experience. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Sarah. Every Sunday evening, without fail, a cloud would descend over her. It would start as a small thought around 4 in the afternoon, "Oh, tomorrow's Monday," and by 8 o'clock, that small thought had bloomed into a full-blown storm of anxiety. Her stomach would knot. Her shoulders would rise. Her mind would race through every possible disaster the upcoming week could bring. Sarah came to see me because she wanted the Sunday night dread to go away. I asked her one question. "When the Sunday night dread arrives, what's your breath doing?" She looked at me blankly. She'd never noticed. She was so caught up in the content of the dread that she'd never once looked at the foundation upon which that dread was built. I asked her to close her eyes and bring to mind a typical Sunday evening. As she did, her breathing changed. It became shallow. It moved up into her chest. It became irregular. "There," I said. "That's the first fabricator at work. Before the dread fully arrives, your body has already started building the set." The breath tightens, and that tightness signals to the mind that something is wrong. The mind then looks for something to attach that wrongness to, and it finds Monday. But Monday itself isn't the problem. The problem is the tightness you're building around it. This is the profound insight the Buddha offered. We tend to think emotions arise from situations. But the Buddha pointed to something more empowering. The emotion arises from how we fabricate the situation. And at the very base of that fabrication is the breath. Think of the breath as the foundation of a house. If the foundation is crooked, the whole house is crooked. If the breath is tight and shallow, the whole emotional state built on top of it will be tight and shallow. You can't build a calm mind on top of an agitated breath. This is why the Buddha placed such enormous emphasis on breath meditation. The breath is always here. It's always happening. And it's responsive to your attention. You can't directly control your thoughts. Try to stop thinking and the thoughts just get louder. But you can directly control your breath. You can lengthen it. You can soften it. You can breathe into places of tension. And when you change the breath, you change everything built on top of it. Think of a time recently when you felt irritated. Just bring that memory to mind for a moment. Now notice what happens in your body. Chances are, your breath has already changed. It's probably become a little tighter. Maybe your jaw has clenched. Now take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Soften your jaw. Take another slow, easy breath. What happened to the irritation? It's still there, maybe, but it's softer. It has less grip on you. You haven't resolved the situation that caused it. But you've changed the foundation, and the whole structure shifted. Let me introduce you to a man named Marcus. Marcus was a corporate lawyer who woke up every night around 3 in the morning with his heart pounding. His mind would immediately latch onto something from work. Then the inner voice would start. You shouldn't have said that. You're going to lose this client. Everything is going to fall apart. By 4 in the morning, Marcus would be fully convinced his life was about to collapse. I asked him, when you wake up and the thoughts start, what happens in your body? Heart pounding. Breath shallow. Chest tight. Muscles rigid. And what happens next? That's when the thoughts get really bad. Do you see the sequence? The body activates first. That's bodily fabrication. Then the inner voice grabs that physical activation and builds a story around it. The story isn't caused by reality. You haven't actually lost your job. The story is caused by the physical activation. This is the dance of the 3 fabricators. They work together, each feeding the others. The bodily fabricator creates tension. The verbal fabricator builds a story around the tension. The mental fabricator slaps threatening labels on everything. And then the bodily fabricator responds with even more tension. It's a feedback loop that runs automatically until we learn to interrupt it. The Buddha's genius was in seeing we can interrupt it at any point. But the bodily fabricator, the breath, is often the easiest place to start because it's concrete. You can feel it right now. For Marcus, the practice became simple. When he woke up at 3 a.m. with his heart pounding, instead of getting caught in the story, he would put his attention on his breath. Just feel it. Feel the pounding heart. Feel the tight chest. But instead of adding the story, he would just breathe. Long, slow breaths. He'd breathe into the tightness. He'd breathe out the tension. The first few times, it didn't work well. The thoughts kept pulling at him. But he kept at it. Night after night. Slowly, something shifted. He began to see that the pounding heart wasn't the enemy. It was just a sensation. The thoughts weren't prophecies. They were just stories his mind was building on top of sensations. He began to see the gap between the physical activation and the mental story. And in that gap, he found a sliver of freedom. This is what the Buddha meant when he said liberation is found right here, in the body, in the breath. Not after you've fixed all your problems. Right here, in the middle of your messy human experience. The freedom isn't in making sensations go away. The freedom is in no longer being enslaved by the stories you build on top of them. So right now, notice your own breath. Just feel it. Where is it? Deep or shallow? Fast or slow? This noticing is the beginning of waking up from automatic fabrication. It's the moment you remember you're not just watching the movie. You're projecting it. Now let's turn our attention to the second fabricator, the inner voice. The verbal fabrication. The constant narrator that lives inside your head. I want to tell you about a man named David. David was a successful architect in his early 50s. By any external measure, he had a good life. A thriving practice, a loving family, good health. But David carried something with him everywhere he went, a low-grade, persistent sense of not being good enough. It showed up in subtle ways. When someone complimented his work, his inner voice would immediately say, "They're just being polite. They don't really mean it." When he made a small mistake, the voice would say, "See? You're not as good as everyone thinks. You're a fraud. Eventually everyone will find out." David had lived with this voice for so long he thought it was simply the truth. He thought the voice was him. He thought its assessments were accurate reflections of reality. One day, I asked him to do something simple. I asked him to notice the voice. Not to argue with it. Not to try to make it go away. Just to notice it as a phenomenon. To notice when it started, what it said, how it made him feel. He looked at me confused. Notice it? But it's just me thinking. Is it? I asked. If you can notice the voice, then you must be separate from it, at least a little bit. The watcher and the voice can't be the same thing. This is the radical shift the Buddha invites us to make. We spend our entire lives identified with the inner voice. We think we are the voice. But the Buddha said, no, that voice is just another fabrication. It's something you do, not something you are. It's an activity, not an identity. Think about it. When you were a child, you didn't have this same inner voice. It developed over time. It was conditioned by your parents, your teachers, your culture, your experiences. It's a collection of habits, not a permanent self. And because it's a collection of habits, it can be changed. The Buddha described verbal fabrication as directed thought and evaluation. It's the mind talking to itself. It's the questions you ask and the answers you provide. What should I do about this? Why did that happen? What does this mean about me? This constant inner conversation shapes your entire emotional landscape. Let me give you another example. A woman named Patricia came to see me about her anger. She was angry at her ex-husband, and the anger had been festering for years. She'd replay conversations in her head, imagining all the things she should have said. She'd rehearse arguments she hoped to have someday. She'd tell the story of their breakup to anyone who would listen, each time adding more detail, more evidence of his wrongdoing. I asked her, who's suffering from this inner monologue? Is he lying awake at night replaying these conversations? Is his body flooded with stress hormones every time you tell the story? She got very quiet. She saw it immediately. She was the only one in the theater. He'd moved on years ago. But she was still in the movie, watching the same scenes over and over, and the only person suffering was her. This is the power of verbal fabrication. The stories we tell ourselves aren't harmless entertainment. They shape our biology, our emotions, our entire experience of life. If you tell yourself a story of victimhood, you will feel like a victim. If you tell yourself a story of inadequacy, you will feel inadequate. If you tell yourself a story of resentment, you will live in anger. But here's the hopeful news. If you can see the story as a story, you can choose a different one. This doesn't mean lying to yourself. It doesn't mean pretending everything is fine when it's not. It means recognizing that your current story is just one possible interpretation of events, and it might not even be the most accurate one. Patricia began a new practice. When the old story of resentment arose, she would notice it. She'd say to herself, there's that old story again. And then she'd ask herself a new question. What's another way to see this? What might I have missed? Is there any good that came from that difficult time? She wasn't excusing her ex-husband's behavior. She wasn't pretending the pain didn't happen. She was simply loosening the grip of the old story by acknowledging that it was just one story among many possible stories. Over time, the old story lost its charge. It still comes sometimes, but it's quieter now. It doesn't have the same power over her. She's not living in that movie anymore. This is what the Buddha meant when he talked about right speech, not just the words we say to others, but the words we say to ourselves. The inner voice can be a tool for liberation or a tool for bondage. It all depends on how skillfully we use it. So here's a question for you to carry into your day. When your inner voice speaks, are you listening as if it's the truth? Or are you listening as a story, just one fabrication among many? Now we arrive at the third fabricator, mental fabrication. This one is more subtle than the breath or the inner voice, but it's just as powerful. Mental fabrication consists of two parts: perceptions and feelings. Perceptions are the labels we put on everything. You see a shape in the darkness and your mind labels it snake. Your body floods with adrenaline. You flip on the light and see it's just a rope. Same shape. Same visual data. But the label changed, and with it, your entire experience changed. This is happening constantly. You walk into a room and see a person. Your mind instantly labels them. Friend. Enemy. Attractive. Boring. Threatening. Safe. And once the label is applied, the rest of your experience conforms to it. You don't see the person anymore. You see your label. I once worked with a woman named Claire who had a difficult relationship with her mother. Every interaction left her feeling drained and angry. When I asked her to describe her mother, she used the same words every time. Controlling. Critical. Never satisfied. I asked her to try something different. I asked her to spend a week simply noticing her mother without applying those labels. Just observe her as if she were a stranger. Notice her mannerisms. Notice the things she says. Notice her fears, her hopes, her history. Claire came back a week later and said something surprising. I saw her differently. She's still difficult. She still says things that bother me. But I also saw that she's afraid. She's lonely. She doesn't know how to connect any other way. She's not just controlling. She's a whole person. The label hadn't changed her mother. But it changed Claire's experience of her mother. And with that change came a little more space, a little more patience, a little more compassion. This is the power of perception. It's not that the world doesn't exist outside our labels. It's that we never experience the world directly. We experience it through the filter of our perceptions. And those perceptions are fabrications. They're things we do, not things we receive. Let me give you another example. A young man named Thomas came to see me about his social anxiety. He would walk into a room full of people and his mind would instantly start labeling. They're judging me. They can tell I'm nervous. They think I'm weird. These perceptions would trigger his bodily fabrication, shallow breath, racing heart, sweaty palms. And his verbal fabrication would join in. See? You're messing up again. You should just leave. Thomas was trapped in a feedback loop of his own making. The labels weren't reality. They were just labels. But he believed them completely. I asked him to experiment. Next time he walked into a social situation, I wanted him to notice the labels as they arose. Just notice them. They're judging me. I'm weird. And then I wanted him to ask one question: do I actually know this is true? Can I read their minds? Or is this just a story my mind is telling? The first few times, the labels still ran the show. But gradually, something shifted. He began to see the gap between the label and reality. He began to see that his mind was constantly fabricating threats that didn't exist. And in seeing that, the threats lost their power. The second part of mental fabrication is feeling, not emotion, but the basic affective tone of every experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Every single moment carries one of these three tones. The taste of chocolate is pleasant. Stubbing your toe is unpleasant. The sensation of your left foot in your shoe is probably neutral. And the mind has a deep, automatic drive to move toward the pleasant, push away the unpleasant, and ignore the neutral. This drive is the engine of suffering. It's what keeps us constantly reaching, constantly grasping, constantly avoiding. And it operates below the level of conscious awareness unless we train ourselves to see it. Let me tell you about a man named Robert. Robert was a recovering alcoholic. He'd been sober for 3 years, but he still struggled with cravings. The cravings would come as a physical sensation, a tightness in his chest, a restlessness in his limbs. And then the feeling tone would kick in. Unpleasant. Very unpleasant. And the mind's automatic response to unpleasantness is to want it to go away. For Robert, the quickest way to make it go away had always been a drink. He learned to work with this by separating the feeling from the response. When the craving arose, he would notice the unpleasant sensation. He'd feel it fully. He'd explore its qualities, where it was located, what it felt like, how it changed moment to moment. And he'd notice the mind's desire to make it stop. But instead of acting on that desire, he'd just breathe. He'd let the unpleasantness be there without trying to escape it. And here's what he discovered. Unpleasant feelings don't last forever. They arise, they hang around for a while, and then they pass away. The only reason they become suffering is because we try to push them away. The pushing is the suffering. The feeling itself is just a feeling. This is the training. Learning to see perceptions as perceptions, not as reality. Learning to feel feelings without being driven by them. Learning that you are not your labels and you are not your likes and dislikes. You are the awareness in which all of this arises and passes away. So here's a practice for today. Notice one perception you're holding. Just one. Maybe it's a label you've put on someone. Maybe it's a label you've put on yourself. Ask yourself, is this the whole truth? Or is it just one way of seeing? And notice one feeling tone. Just one. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Can you let it be there without needing it to be different? This is the path. Not escaping from perceptions and feelings, but seeing through them. And in the seeing, finding freedom. Now I want to tell you a story that brings all three fabricators together. This is a story about a woman named Grace and her commute to work. Every morning, Grace would get in her car and drive 30 minutes to her office. And every morning, without fail, she would arrive feeling exhausted and irritable. She couldn't understand it. She wasn't doing anything particularly stressful. She was just sitting in traffic. I asked her to walk me through a typical commute. She described getting in the car, starting the engine, and pulling out of her driveway. Then she hit the highway. And that's when it would start. The first thing she noticed was the other drivers. Someone would cut her off, and her inner voice would immediately engage. Can you believe that guy? What an idiot. Another driver would go too slow. Come on, move over. By the time she'd been on the highway for 10 minutes, her jaw was clenched, her shoulders were tight, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. This is bodily fabrication at work. The body was responding to the stories the mind was telling. Then the inner voice would expand its scope. It would move from the other drivers to her job. I can't believe I have to go to that stupid meeting today. My boss is going to be so annoying. I never get any appreciation. This is verbal fabrication spinning stories about the future. And then the perceptions would kick in. She'd label the traffic as torture. She'd label her job as a prison. She'd label her life as one long slog. This is mental fabrication coloring everything with unpleasantness. By the time Grace arrived at work, she'd already lived an entire drama of frustration and resentment. And none of it was real. The traffic was just traffic. The other drivers were just people trying to get to work. Her job was just a job. But the three fabricators had built an entire reality out of these raw materials, and Grace was living in that reality. I asked Grace to try something different. I asked her to use her commute as a meditation practice. The next morning, she got in her car and set her intention. For the next 30 minutes, she would simply notice the three fabricators at work. She wouldn't try to stop them. She'd just observe them. She noticed when someone cut her off. She noticed the inner voice start its rant. And instead of joining the rant, she just observed it. Ah, there's the voice. She noticed her jaw clenching. She noticed her shoulders tightening. And instead of letting the tension build, she took a conscious breath. She deliberately relaxed her jaw. She dropped her shoulders. She noticed when her mind started projecting into the future, worrying about the meeting, dreading her boss. She observed the thoughts as they arose. There's the future story. And she brought her attention back to the present moment, the feel of her hands on the wheel, the sight of the road ahead. She noticed when her mind started slapping labels on everything. Torture. Prison. Slog. She observed the labels and thought, these are just words. They're not reality. The reality is just driving. Just this moment. The first few days, it was hard. Her mind kept pulling her back into the old patterns. But she kept at it. Day after day. After a few weeks, she noticed something surprising. She was arriving at work feeling calm. Not exhausted. Not irritable. Just calm. The traffic hadn't changed. The other drivers hadn't changed. Her job hadn't changed. But her experience had changed completely. She said to me, I used to think the commute was something I had to endure to get to my real life. Now I see that the commute is my life. It's 30 minutes of my life every day. And I was spending it being miserable. Now I spend it practicing. This is the power of understanding the three fabrications. Not that life stops giving you difficult raw material. Life will always give you difficult raw material. But you stop building prisons out of it. You stop adding the stories, the tensions, the labels that turn a neutral situation into a painful one. Let me give you another example. A man named Frank worked in a busy restaurant kitchen. The environment was loud, hot, and chaotic. Orders were constantly coming in. The head chef was demanding. Frank used to leave every shift completely depleted. He started applying the same practice. When the heat and noise started to overwhelm him, he'd notice his bodily fabrication, the tension, the shallow breathing. He'd take a breath and consciously relax. He'd notice his verbal fabrication, the inner complaints, the stories about how unfair everything was. He'd observe them without adding fuel. He'd notice his perceptions, labeling the kitchen as hell and the chef as tyrant. He'd question those labels. Is this really hell? Or is it just a busy kitchen? Over time, Frank's experience of work transformed. The environment hadn't changed. It was still loud and hot and chaotic. But he was no longer adding the extra layer of suffering on top of it. He was just working. Grace still gets cut off in traffic sometimes. Her inner voice still starts its rant occasionally. But she sees it now. She sees it as soon as it starts. And because she sees it, she has a choice. She can follow the rant into frustration, or she can take a breath, relax her shoulders, and come back to the present moment. The choice is always there. It's always available in every moment. The only question is whether you remember to take it. Now I want to share with you a story about a man named Henry and his experience with loss. Henry's father had passed away about 2 years before we met. They'd had a complicated relationship. Love mixed with disappointment, affection mixed with unspoken criticism. After his father died, Henry found himself unable to move forward. He was stuck in a loop of regret and rumination that played constantly in the background of his days. The loop went like this. Something would trigger a memory, a song on the radio, a photograph tucked away in a drawer, a turn of phrase someone used in conversation. And then the verbal fabricator would start its work. I should have visited more. I should have told him I loved him. I should have been a better son. Why didn't I say those things when I had the chance? Now it's too late. Now I'll never get the chance again. This inner voice would run and run, sometimes for hours, repeating the same accusations, the same regrets, the same painful questions. It was like a broken record that he couldn't turn off. With the voice came the bodily fabrication. A heavy sensation in his chest, a tightness in his throat, a feeling of being physically weighed down. His shoulders would slump. His energy would drop. His breathing would become shallow and constrained, as if the weight of regret was literally pressing down on his lungs. And then the mental fabrication would add its layer. The perception of himself as a failure of a son. The perception of his father as a missed opportunity. The perception of the past as something that needed fixing but couldn't be fixed. The feeling tone was intensely unpleasant, and his mind's natural response was to try to escape it. But he couldn't escape. The thoughts kept coming back, and the more he tried to push them away, the more persistent they became. Henry came to see me because he wanted the pain to stop. He wanted to get over his father's death and move on with his life. He tried therapy, support groups, self-help books. Nothing had fully released him from the loop. I asked him a question. When the regret arises, can you separate the sensation from the story? He looked at me confused, so I explained further. There's the physical sensation in your chest. That heaviness. That tightness. That's one thing, a raw physical experience. And then there's the story your mind tells about that sensation, the story about being a bad son, about missed opportunities, about failure. Those are two completely different things. Can you feel the sensation without adding the story? He closed his eyes and brought the memory to mind. Immediately, the heaviness appeared in his chest. And immediately, the story began. I should have. Just the sensation, I reminded him gently. Just feel it. Don't add anything to it. Where is it exactly? What does it feel like? Does it have a temperature? Does it move or stay still? Is it sharp or dull? Just investigate it like a scientist. He stayed with it for a long moment, his face relaxed in concentration. Then he opened his eyes. It's still there, he said quietly. The heaviness. But it's different. It's not as overwhelming. It's just there. Like an object I'm looking at instead of something I'm drowning in. This was the beginning of Henry's healing. Not making the sensation go away. Not fixing the story. Not finding the right memory that would undo the past. Just learning to separate the raw physical experience from the elaborate mental construction built on top of it. The Buddha taught that grief, like all emotions, is a fabrication. That doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean Henry's love for his father wasn't real or his loss wasn't real. It means the experience of grief is something we actively participate in creating, moment by moment. It's something we do, not just something that happens to us. And if it's something we do, we can learn to do it differently. Over the following weeks, Henry practiced this separation diligently. When the regret arose, he'd feel the physical sensation directly. He'd breathe into it. He'd explore its qualities with curiosity instead of aversion. And he'd watch the story arise without believing it completely, without adding fuel to its fire. He noticed something fascinating. The story was always the same. The same words, the same accusations, the same script playing over and over. It was like a recording on a loop. And he began to really see, that the recording wasn't truth. It was just a recording. It was the voice of grief speaking its habitual lines, not the voice of reality delivering final judgment. He also began to notice something else. There were moments when the story wasn't playing at all. Moments of peace. Moments of simple presence. Moments when he could remember his father and feel only love, without the overlay of regret. He saw that the grief wasn't continuous. It came in waves. And between the waves, there was space. He learned to rest in that space. One day, he said something remarkable. "I still miss my father. I still wish things had been different. But I'm not torturing myself anymore. The grief is just grief now. It's not a punishment I'm serving. This is the promise of working with the three fabrications. Not that difficult emotions stop arising. They arise. Grief arises. Regret arises. Loss arises. That's part of being human. But you stop adding the extra layer, the self-criticism, the endless rumination, the story that turns a natural emotion into an endless loop of suffering. The heaviness in the chest is just heaviness. The tightness in the throat is just tightness. The memory is just memory. The pain of loss is real and deserves to be honored. But the suffering we add on top of it, that's optional. That's extra. That's fabrication. And when you see that, really see it, something fundamental shifts. You stop fighting your experience. You stop trying to make the feelings go away. You learn to be with them, to hold them in awareness, to let them be exactly what they are without adding anything extra. And in that holding, in that allowing, the feelings lose their power over you. They come and they go, like waves on the ocean. And you remain, like the ocean itself. Vast, deep, and undisturbed beneath the surface motion. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Irene and her battle with perfectionism. Irene was a graphic designer, talented and successful by any objective measure. Her clients loved her work. Her colleagues respected her. But Irene lived in a state of constant low-grade anxiety because nothing she did was ever quite good enough in her own eyes. The process went like this. She'd finish a project, and for a brief moment, she'd feel satisfaction. Then the verbal fabricator would step in. "That's good, but you could have done better. The colors aren't quite right. The alignment is off. The client probably won't even notice, but you know it's not perfect. You should have spent more time on it. You're always rushing. You're never going to be as good as so-and-so." By the time this inner monologue finished, the satisfaction was long gone, replaced by a familiar feeling of inadequacy. The bodily fabricator would join in, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching, stomach knotting. The mental fabricator would provide the labels: mediocre, fraud, not enough. Irene came to meditation hoping to quiet this critical inner voice. She wanted it to stop. She wanted to feel good about her work. I asked her a different question. What if the voice isn't the problem? What if your relationship to the voice is the problem? She looked puzzled, so I explained. The voice is just a voice. It's just thoughts arising. The suffering isn't in the voice. The suffering is in believing it, in fighting it, in trying to make it go away. What if you could just let it be there without letting it run your life? This is a radical shift in perspective. We spend so much energy trying to get rid of negative thoughts. We argue with them. We try to replace them with positive ones. We judge ourselves for having them. But the Buddha pointed to a different approach, simply seeing them as fabrications, as mental events, without getting caught in their content. Irene began a new practice. When the critical voice arose, she'd notice it. She'd say to herself, "Ah, there's the critic." Not with anger, not with frustration, just with recognition. She'd notice the bodily sensations that accompanied it. The tension, the tightness. She'd breathe into them, relaxing as much as she could. And she'd notice the labels, mediocre, fraud, and see them as just words, just perceptions, not absolute truths. The first few weeks, the voice was as loud as ever. But something subtle was shifting. She was no longer completely identified with it. There was a tiny space between the voice and her awareness of it. And in that space, there was a feeling of freedom. One day, she was working on a project and the voice started its usual critique. She noticed it, and instead of spiraling into hours of self-doubt, she just kept working. The voice was there, but it was just background noise now. It didn't stop her. It didn't derail her. It was just sound. She called me later and said, "I think this is the first time I've ever finished a project without hating myself at the end." This is the power of seeing through the fabrications. Not that the thoughts stop coming, but they stop being the bosses of you. They become what they always were, just thoughts, just mental events, just conditioned responses arising and passing away. Let me give you another example. A man named Carl struggled with social anxiety. Before any social event, his mind would fill with predictions of disaster. No one will talk to you. You'll stand in the corner like an idiot. People will think you're weird. This verbal fabrication would trigger bodily fabrication, sweaty palms, racing heart, shallow breath. And mental fabrication would label the whole experience as torture. Carl tried for years to get rid of these thoughts. He'd tell himself, "Stop being anxious. Just relax. Be normal." But the thoughts only got louder. When he started working with the 3 fabrications, he tried something different. Before a social event, he'd sit quietly and let the thoughts come. He'd let the anxiety be there. He'd feel the physical sensations without trying to escape them. He'd notice the labels and see them as just labels. And then he'd go to the event anyway. The anxiety was still there. But it wasn't in charge anymore. He could feel anxious and still talk to people. He could feel anxious and still be present. The anxiety was just one more sensation in the field of his awareness, not the entire field itself. This is the training. Not to become a person who never feels anxious, never feels inadequate, never feels grief. That's impossible. The training is to become a person who can feel all of those things without being controlled by them. To feel them fully, yes, but to see them as visitors, not as permanent residents. To see them as fabrications, not as the truth of who you are. And in that seeing, to find a peace that isn't dependent on everything being perfect. A peace that can hold the imperfect, the difficult, the painful, and still remain undisturbed. Now I want to share a story about a man named Walter and his experience with anger. Walter was retired military, a man who'd spent 30 years in service and had developed a temper that he'd learned to control but never truly understand. In retirement, the anger found new targets. Neighbors whose dogs barked too long. Cashiers who moved too slow. Politicians on the television. Family members who didn't call enough. The anger would arrive suddenly, like a storm. Someone would do something minor, a car cutting him off, a store clerk being rude, and Walter's body would ignite. His jaw would clamp shut. His fists would clench. His breathing would become rapid and aggressive. This was bodily fabrication preparing him for a fight. Then the inner voice would begin its work. Who does he think he is? Someone needs to teach that guy a lesson. This is exactly what's wrong with the world today. Nobody has any respect anymore. The verbal fabricator would build an entire case, gathering evidence, constructing arguments, justifying the rage. And the mental fabricator would supply the labels. Enemy. Idiot. Disrespectful. Threat. Every perception was filtered through the lens of anger, turning neutral events into personal attacks. Walter came to meditation because his wife had told him she couldn't live with his anger anymore. He didn't want to lose her. He wanted the anger to stop. I asked him a question. When the anger comes, can you feel it in your body before you act on it? He thought about it. I feel it. But by the time I feel it, it's already too late. I've already said something or done something. Then we need to catch it earlier, I said. We need to catch it at the breath. We began a simple practice. Every day, Walter would sit for 15 minutes and just watch his breath. Not controlling it, just watching. In and out. In and out. He learned to notice the texture of the breath, smooth or rough, deep or shallow. He learned to feel the subtle changes. Then we added another layer. Throughout the day, he'd check in with his breath. Waiting in line at the store. Check the breath. Sitting at a red light. Check the breath. Watching the news. Check the breath. He began to notice something interesting. The anger never arrived without warning. There was always a precursor, a slight tightening in the chest, a shallowness in the breath, a warmth spreading through his face. These were the early signals, the first whispers of bodily fabrication. He'd never noticed them before because he was always caught in the story, always swept away by the content. Now he was learning to notice the foundation before the building was complete. One afternoon, a neighbor's dog started barking while Walter was trying to read. The old pattern would have been immediate irritation, followed by a crescendo of anger, followed by storming outside to yell at the neighbor. But this time, Walter noticed the breath first. He felt the slight tightening. He felt the shallowness. And instead of letting the verbal fabricator take over, he just breathed. He took a long, slow, deliberate breath. Then another. He felt the anger rising, but he didn't feed it. He didn't add the story. He just kept breathing. The dog kept barking. But Walter kept breathing. After a few minutes, he realized the intense heat of the anger had subsided. It was still there, a mild irritation, but it wasn't running him anymore. He picked up his book and continued reading. Later, he told me, "I didn't do anything. I just breathed. And the anger passed. It actually passed. I've spent my whole life thinking I had to do something with anger, express it or suppress it. But I never just let it be there and watched it go away on its own. This is the training. Not to become someone who never gets angry. Anger will arise. That's part of being human in a world that doesn't always go your way. The training is to become someone who doesn't get possessed by anger. Someone who can feel the fire without being burned by it. The Buddha taught that anger is a fabrication, just like everything else. It's built from bodily sensations, verbal stories, and mental perceptions. And because it's built, it can be unbuilt. Not by fighting it, but by seeing its components clearly. By noticing the breath before it tightens. By watching the story without believing it. By seeing the labels as just labels. When you see anger as a collection of parts, it loses its solidity. It becomes less real, less overwhelming, less in charge. It becomes what it always was, a passing storm in the vast sky of awareness. Walter still gets angry sometimes. He still feels the tightening, the heat, the urge to strike out. But now he has a choice. He can breathe. He can watch. He can let the storm pass without destroying everything in its path. And in that choice, he's found a peace he never thought possible. Let me leave you with one last story. This is a story about a woman named Alice and her journey to the end of fabrication. Alice had been meditating for years. She'd worked with the breath, learned to observe her inner voice, studied her perceptions and feelings. She could sit for an hour with her mind perfectly still, resting in a space of profound peace. By any measure, she was an accomplished practitioner. But something was still off. She described it as a subtle dissatisfaction, a thin layer of "not quite there yet" that colored everything. Even in her deepest meditations, there was a sense of waiting, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the final breakthrough, waiting to become someone who had finally arrived. I asked her a question. Who is it that's waiting? She looked confused. What do you mean? There's this sense of waiting. This sense of not quite being there yet. Who is experiencing that? Who is the one who isn't satisfied? Who is the one still striving? She sat with the question for a long time. Then she said, "It's me. I'm the one waiting." And who is this me? More silence. Then something shifted in her face. It's just another fabrication, isn't it? To me, that's waiting is just more thoughts, more perceptions, more feelings. I've been trying to get rid of all the other fabrications, but I held on to the fabricator. I held on to the sense that there's someone here who needs to get somewhere. This is the final threshold. The Buddha taught that even the sense of self, the feeling that there's a me behind all experience, is a fabrication. It's built from the same materials as everything else. It's a process, not a thing. And like all processes, it can be seen through. This doesn't mean you disappear. It means the sense of being a separate self, a solid entity standing apart from experience, is recognized as just another construction. And when that construction is seen clearly, something remarkable happens. The striving stops. The waiting stops. The seeking stops. Not because you found what you were looking for, but because you see there was never anywhere to go. Alice had been using the three fabrications skillfully to build concentration, to build insight, to build a path. And that was necessary. You can't just skip the work. But at a certain point, the building stops. The fabricator rests. And what's left is not something you can describe. It's not something you can grasp. It's not something you can become. It's just this. Just this breath. Just this moment. Just this awareness, free from the need to fabricate anything at all. The Buddha called this the unfabricated. The deathless. The unconditioned. Not a place you go, but a dimension you touch when the fabrication of self and world and time finally falls silent. You don't have to wait for that moment. It's available now, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between breaths, in the awareness that's reading these words. The fabrications arise and pass away, but the awareness remains. That awareness is your true home. So here's my invitation. Keep working with the three fabrications. Keep learning to breathe skillfully, to speak to yourself wisely, to perceive clearly. Use these tools to build peace, to build concentration, to build insight. But remember, you are not the tools. You are the one holding them. And when you're ready, set them down. Just for a moment. Rest in the awareness that was never fabricated, that was never born, that will never die. That is the end of suffering. That is the end of the path. That is peace. Thank you for practicing with us at Monk's Temple. May you be happy. May you be peaceful. May you be free.